Is that green light on that mic?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
All right. So I'm going to get started this morning. I think everyone knows me. I'm Shankar Levine. I'm one of the ER docs, and I have the pleasure of introducing Anant today. One of the things I love about emergency medicine is it draws people of different interests and backgrounds, and they come into emergency medicine, get a skill set, and then take that skill set and apply that to very different environments. And that's one of the things that Anant is a perfect example of. Because as all of you know, or most of you know, in his other hats, he's Major Anant Shukla before coming to residency, worked as a flight surgeon in Afghanistan, among many other things. But for those of you who know me, know that I'm not going to tell you about the different medals he received, which are numerous, because I can't tell the difference between the best and the worst. I have no idea. Right?
They were the best.
They were all the best. When he came to the civilian side and started residency here, he put his intelligence gathering and mission execution skills to work in getting a couple of grants, and has done excellent work in kind of art and also airway and a bunch of research areas. And you can kind of tell how thoughtful Anant is about different things and many perspective pieces that he's written. And on a personal note, I was in Bhutan with Michael and Anant, and we did a bunch of different trainings, and it was great to have Anant there. It was a huge asset to all the trainings we were doing. And one of the things he ended up teaching was tourniquet application. And so I stepped aside. I hadn't seen anything happening, and he came up with the tourniquet. He was like, today we're going to talk about U.S. Army issue combat application tourniquet. And so one of the Bhutanese attendings next to me leaned in and said, you really picked the right person for the job. All right, Anant, you're up.
All right.
Hey, what's going on? Thanks for inviting me to do this Grand Rounds. The title of my talk is The Story I Didn't Tell My Mom, or How to Manage a Mass Casualty Event. I am by no means an expert in terms of managing mass casualty events, but I've been in 3 of them overseas, and I've been in 1 here on the civilian side. And when I started to prepare this talk, honestly, when I was a PGY1, I had the opportunity to kind of read about other experiences, and in kind of deconstructing my own experience, I saw that there were a lot of themes that kind of were underlying mass casualty events in the military and also mass casualty events in the civilian side. And I wanted to take the opportunity to speak to this event, not necessarily to give you an algorithm, but to kind of give a couple teaching points or things that I have observed in going through the research, because most of the research is qualitative. It's not quantitative. So I'd like to give a special welcome to my mom, who is actually listening to this. Also to members of Task Force Apocalypse, a aviation asset that I was the physician for, who are also listening in, along with some of my classmates for medical school who think that they can get CME from this. So, okay. So guys, if you're trying to get CME, this is the code. Most of my classmates from medical school are all attendings now. I am like me and this other dude are the odd ducks, but so. Okay, I do have conflicts of interest or money that I've received from people. I received a grant from the Hitchcock Foundation to study difficult airways and augmented reality and artificial intelligence in terms of improving that. I got money from Jack and Dorothy Byrne for the Art in the ED Foundation, and I'm obviously an employee of the United States Army. And everything I say is my opinion, my own experiences. This presentation, a version of it, was reviewed by an Army intelligence officer to ensure that there is no classified information that may be revealed. Okay, so what is a mass casualty event? So a mass casualty event is really any type of incident that generates a number of casualties or an acuity of casualties that overwhelms the system that is designed to manage it at a particular period of time. Now, obviously, I'm going to talk about it in terms of my experience in combat, But it can absolutely happen in environmental settings. There's a bunch of wildfires that occurred in Colorado, and they generated a lot of casualties for those hospital systems. It could happen from industrial explosions in Bhopal, India. There was a massive explosion that created a bunch of casualties. And it can also happen from terrorism, both domestically and internationally. And I would say, hey, does anyone know what this picture is from? But I'll tell you this, that this picture could be from Sandy Hook. This picture could be from Aurora. But this picture was taken about 3 hours away from our institution in Lewiston, Maine, about a drive that most of us could make in less than a day. And this is a event that was kind of a shock for this community because there's a singular individual who ended up killing about 14 people, and then, 22 people, but 14 people were injured and brought to a level 2 trauma center that was associated with Maine Health that had about 250 beds. The charge nurse at the time in an interview said that there were 50 people in the department at the time. That's very similar to anything that any people in my cohort or any people who graduate from this organization will end up in. And this is definitely a situation that many of you may find yourself into. It's not just things that happen in war, it's things that happen sometimes uncomfortably close to home. There are people in this room who, when they were faculty at one of the Harvard institutions, were involved during the Boston Marathon bombing. This is a perspective article published in the New England Journal of Medicine describing how well they handled that event. There were 3 people that died during the Boston Marathon bombing. There were 20 people that were critically injured, and less than 300 that were injured but not critically. The Boston Athletic Association had drilled what would happen if they had a mass casualty event, not just the bombing, but any type of event to that extent. And in this article, they talked about the importance of the drills that MGH, Brigham, Boston Medical Center, and Tufts all did if in the situation that this actually became a reality. In this article, they talked about how at MGH, within 8 minutes, they had someone from the scene in a resuscitation bay to the operating room, because that is what they drilled. And that will be another theme that kind of comes up later. And the reason why I bring this up is that I'm obviously a military guy, but what I'm trying to say is that what I'm about to tell you, there is something that you can get away from it. The concept of mass casualty management is not the medicine per se. It's the management of the chaos. It's the management of the impact of having so many people with so many particularly critical injuries, and how do you decompress your system and surge your capacity. This is General Leary. He was Napoleon's chief general during his campaigns on the Eastern Front. He came up with the term of triage here. And Michael, please, I know I'm not pronouncing it correctly, but it's French and it means triage. And he was the one who came up with the idea that French forces, as they progressed across the land, could only carry so much resources in terms of a medical capacity. And as they sustained casualties in combat, they couldn't save everybody. And in my literature review, there are over 20 different types of triage systems. They've done multiple studies and they have multiple different flaws in their methodology because it's very difficult to do randomized controlled trials in terms of comparing this system versus another system. And what exactly are you measuring? And so the point of this talk is not to say this system is better than another system, because even in the military, we don't have in our doctrine a very particular type of way to do triage. A lot of it is based off of prior experience from people who've deployed and people who've been in mass casualty events. But from a broad strategic purview, the concept is you need to identify the people who are injured. You need to be able to associate them with a category of how quickly they need to be moved from an area in medical treatment and how quickly you can rapidly progress them off of the battle space to the next level of care. In the military, over 20 years of conflict, we have perfected this idea. We don't have it written down in guidelines, but we're very good at identifying who's hurt, getting them stabilized, and rapidly progressing them through the fields of care, as you will see from this story. So the point, and I'll kind of go through this in my talk, is to have some type of system. There is no one type of system that works, but you need to know how you're going to identify people and how you're going to move them. What we did in my unit, in my air assault unit, is that we had pulse oxes. We put them on people that give us 2 readings, that give us the SpO2 and the pulse. And then we would have them either walk or respond kind of with their name. That give us an idea of their mental status, that give us an idea of kind of how they're respiring. So a little bit about kind of my education in terms of this type of stuff. I went to the military's medical school, which was my ascension into the military. And for the past 40 years, what they've been doing is that they bring their first-year medical students and their fourth-year medical students to the field in very rural Pennsylvania for 15 days. For 10 days, you're allowed to take showers, but for 5 days, you don't. And the idea is that we are stimulating an American intervention into a conflict as a medical asset. And the scenario changes time to time, but the idea is the same, is that they teach us over the course of 4 years and in this situation on how to be an austere medical provider and how to move people rapidly through the fields of care. And as a fourth-year medical student, this is a graded event. You have to pass this in order to graduate from medical school. And the people who grade you are at times quite abrasive. My grader was a special forces officer who was a major in the Army, and he was really, really tough. But they're also supposed to coach you. And they're supposed to kind of comment on your ability to have a command presence, demonstrating medical knowledge, how to organize your medical capabilities to accomplish the mission of decompressing your casualties and progressing them through the fields of care. This is absolutely exhausting. This is something that we invite the Israeli military to. When we had better relations with the Chinese military, they would send their students to this. All of NATO would come to this exercise but ultimately the people who were graded were the Americans. But it was a way for us to also build partnerships with partnered allied military medical fields to teach them how we do austere medicine and in areas where there's not a lot of resources. They would wake us up sometimes every 2 to 3 hours and tell us that there's a patient.
Had you done BMT already before you did this?
Had I did what?
Done BMT, like basic training for the Army already?
Yeah, I already went to officers.
So you had done all of that.
But this was way more intense. And it was done intentionally to kind of increase the amount of stress on our body to see how we do. My mass cal, and this is a picture of me when I was probably in my late to mid 20s. I was a fourth year. I had glasses. I had surgery. This is why I don't wear glasses anymore. But my scenario was that there were 30 people in a indigenous village that were injured in a rocket attack, and that the water was poisoned by an enemy force. That was the scenario that was given to me. I had an element that was about 20 to 30 people, an element being a medical asset going with me. And I arrived there with my observer control and my coach, and I completely froze. I remember walking around and looking at all these moulaged people and students that were screaming, and actors and people who were playing members of the State Department and just getting in my face. And I was totally shocked. I remember sitting in the back of the Humvee with my observer controller, and he just shook his head and he gave me feedback. This is not MedHub feedback. This was very, very direct. It was filled with like a lot of F words, but this was the bottom line up front. The bottom line up front was I had a non-existent command presence. I had a complete absence of an operational plan, and I had no rehearsals prior into going into the objective. This is one of those pieces of feedback that honestly probably changed kind of how I am today, in the sense that he gave me this feedback very directly, and then he was like, I'm going to task you with this other officer, and I'm going to recycle you. So I got recycled, and this was incredibly humiliating. It's a type of organization where, like, shame and kind of feeling like you're not worth anything, especially in front of your classmates, can really sit. But the military also does a very good job of giving you this and building you back up. And I then passed. And this is a picture of me passing. I've never smoked a cigar up until this moment. And I got sick because I didn't know that you're not supposed to inhale. You're not supposed to inhale for the ones. So you got to know how to implement the system. And this is like very specific. Where are people standing? Where are people standing? What are you doing? Are you holding a clipboard? Get out. If you're holding a clipboard, you're not doing anything for me. What is your purpose? Where are you standing? What are you doing? And you need to know how to implement your system, whatever that system is. Very briefly, I was a urology resident, and I left that, and I took on a more operational role as a physician for an air assault unit. In that role, I also became the primary care physician for a very small forward operating base in eastern Afghanistan. And in my role, so in addition to being kind of like the primary care doc, I would also be an air assault physician, where I would fly in the back of helicopters with a variety of highly skilled teams to achieve specific objectives. And I think one thing that is unique about the military and being a physician is that you are not the most important person. The most important person in a unit is the commander, and the commander is not a doctor. And this kind of relates to people in this room. Sometimes the person you relate to is a business person, is a CEO, and you need to be able to communicate to them the value you bring to their team. The value you bring to their team, because if you don't demonstrate that, they won't listen to you. They will just push you aside as kind of the guy that doesn't wear their uniform right or talks too complicated. You have to start to build a relationship. And on this picture, on the far right, is my battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Carlson. He is an amazing helicopter pilot. He is not a doctor. He has deployed so many times I can't even count. And when I showed up to the unit, he was like, "Who's this dude? Who's this guy? His hair's too long." But what I was able to do, and honestly, I'm very fortunate just because I'm a very extroverted type of guy, is I was able to develop a relationship with him. And I was able to show him that preparing medically for our deployment to Afghanistan was within our interests as a unit because of where we were going. And on the far left is Sergeant Major Crowley, who's probably one of the crustiest guys I've ever met. He has deployed 14 times outside of the country and was in a special operations unit. And the guy in the middle ran our UAV systems. The point of this picture is to show that these people are nothing like me. They come from totally different backgrounds, but generating a relationship with them where you could say, I want to teach people how to place a tourniquet appropriately before we deploy, is within the interest of making sure that we come home alive. And beyond that, you have obviously, the people you work for within an organization. But when you go out into the community, what other hospitals are there? What other resources are there in the community? When we went into Afghanistan, there was a special forces unit that was across the airstrip, and there was a surgical team that was assigned just to them. It was just there for the special forces and the commandos. And the people on this picture, very luckily, I knew them all. The top left picture is the current associate program director at Madigan. He was a PGY-6 when I was at MS-4. Chase Dukes was an orthopedic surgeon. He was at PGY-5 when I was at PGY-2. And then Matt Nyland in the middle there was an emergency medicine doc when I was a PGY-3. And then I'll talk about the center picture here shortly. But who's there to help? You need to know who your allies are. You need to have an idea of what your resources are in a certain area, especially if you're going into a place that is potentially dangerous. And so we started to meet with these people on a regular basis and review kind of, hey, what's like the new guideline about kind of hemorrhagic shock? What's the new guideline about TXA? And developing that relationship, because you need to build partners in preparation. You need to know who's above you, who's below you. You need to know who's there to help. And you do that beforehand. And what did we teach before we deployed? ATLS here is obviously designed for the hospital setting. But in the austere environment, we do tactical combat casualty care, which for our wilderness medicine people is kind of based in the March algorithm. And there's 3 phases. You obviously do care while you're actively being engaged by the enemy, which just involves replacing a tourniquet. And then there's the March algorithm, which comes under tactical field care, and then what you do when you're actually rapidly moving the person off the battle space. And the March algorithm is very different because we focus on getting bleeding under control. And then we also kind of focus on airway management. And the rest of the stuff is we didn't really focus on because we wanted to teach people who have no medical background, everyone who kind of washes the floors to the battalion commander, how to place on a tourniquet, how to do some airway maneuvers, and get my attention. And this was these are slides that I literally gave to the guys, and I don't want you to read this. I'm sorry, Dr. Lanter, I know this is a busy slide. So what I want to get is that basically, how do you recognize someone who's bleeding? How do you place a tourniquet appropriately? And that is the big takeaway. And we were able to do this for 30% of the task force prior to deploying, and 100% of the task force, which is about 600 people, 90 days upon our arrival into theater. And these were the things that we taught. Very basic, simplified. It doesn't matter if you're the person that cleans the toilets or if you're the prince. You learn how to do these things and you learn how to do it well. And they've done research on this. The first study was done kind of with Azaz Rabbani medics about kind of the concept of seeing where people stand in terms like a basic airway maneuver, such as a jaw thrust, giving them an instructional course and then retesting them. And there was an 88% improvement in that task. The concept of TCCC was actually developed in the Special Operations Forces. And it wasn't until in the 90s, and it wasn't until 2003 when they actually started teaching it to the regular Army. And what they found was when they did this, people's ability to perform those basic tasks under combat situations and in theater improved if you prepared beforehand. So basically the idea, learning point is when you do your training, no one is immune. Everyone has to do it. Doesn't matter how many medals you have, doesn't matter how high your rank is, because when you do that and you show that the commander is going to this class, the guy who cleans the toilet also knows he's got to go to the class. This is a map of where I was at. The name of the base was Forward Operating Base Dalki, also known as Shank. It was relatively close to the Pakistani border. Right over there. And this was a very high intensity area because the enemy would frequently come this way to bring weapons, personnel, money, to be able to access the highway system around Afghanistan to attack kind of the capital. And Bagram, this thing's not working anymore, but basically Bagrami was kind of like Resolute Support Headquarters, kind of like military headquarters, which was extremely well protected. So when we first came into theater, there was a thought that the war would actually be closing up because there were peace talks with the Taliban. And what ended up happening is that we intercepted communications from the enemy that demonstrated that they had no interest of signing a peace deal that year. And so we had a very good idea that it would be a very busy year, at least the 9 months that I would be there. This was me in a helicopter just flying around kind of where I lived. It's clearly a beautiful area. I'm sure like the hiking would be better if there weren't mines. This was a bunker that was like right near my aid station. And if you look, basically, we were completely surrounded by the enemy. But that's where they all lived. Okay, this is home. So the 2 red crosses are the 2 kind of like medical aid stations. So the airway in the middle was where planes and helicopters take off from. On the left is where the surgeons would be and kind of where our special forces and our commandos would be based. On the right, that Red Cross is where I lived and kind of where The rest of the team would live, and kind of like the rest, like our interpreters, our contractors, and our helicopters were on that side as well. And I'll talk about the green dots here shortly. This was my aid station. That's what it looked like. And basically, we were a role 1, and the job was to stabilize people who were acutely injured and rapidly move them to the next level of care. And in this area, we had developed our MassCal plan. We had developed our system. Where would people show up if they were hurt? After that happened, where would they go next? How would we stabilize them? And we didn't have blood here, but we sure had hemostatic agents. And we had a vehicle. And what we did in our vehicle, instead of just having it as a vehicle, we essentially took everything we could do in our role 1 and put it into the vehicle. And so it was essentially a mobile role 1. And allow us to, at the point of injury or a point where there was an attack or a breach, deliver medical care immediately. And I would ride in the back of this. And we would further take stuff that we have in the role 1 and put it out into the base. We would have areas, casualty collection points, where we had hemostatic agents, tourniquets, needle Ds that anybody could use, especially as we trained them. So I was not the rate limiting factor in terms of someone getting care. Someone got hurt, someone could grab a tourniquet from a casualty collection point and immediately try to, stop the bleed, essentially. And this has been shown in this study. This study was, it's a tough one to kind of like the methodology, but basically the military does an incredible job of recording people who we rapidly move from the battlefield, the type of injuries they have, and they're able to provide a scoring system. And when we introduced tactical combat casualty care in kind of the mid-2000s, we were able to retrospectively review the type of casualties that occurred prior to the introduction of training and then after, and found that the rapid movement of a service member who was injured, the application of blood, and the appropriate placement of a tourniquet was 3 things that decreased our mortality rate during this time frame by 44%. And that is why we developed the mobile role 1, because we could do those 3 things, except the blood, on the scene. And so know what you bring to the fight and spread it. Don't become the rate limiting factor of getting care to somebody. This picture right here. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the guy in the middle with the black shirt. He was my non-commissioned officer, Staff Sergeant Kiesel. And he had a very tough upbringing. At the age of 16, he was emancipated, and he joined the Army really, really young. And in his early 20s, he described to me a situation in which he was a guard in Iraq, and he left very briefly 2 other service members who were his friends. And a lady had a stroller and a child in it, put a grenade in the stroller, approached the checkpoint, and blew up the stroller with the kid. And he saw this, and he had to apply tourniquets to his 2 friends, and it saved his life. He had intense experiences which were invaluable to me. He deployed 4 times, and he helped develop the system. He was very honest with me. He was like, "Hey, sir, I don't know medicine that well. I just do kind of like the dog stuff. Just tell me where to stand, and I'll just do triage." And he was exceptional at it. And beyond that, him and I worked exceptionally as a team. Even though we had completely different backgrounds, we went to all around the base. We developed those relationships and those partnerships with people so that they would be able to give us their medics when something bad would happen. In the event of an attack on the base, all medics, even though I had no command authority of them, would come and work for me. And so we would surge our capacity to beyond just having 2 medics to having between 6 and 8 medics who'll be able to see people, take a history, and control the bleed. The big thing about this is that it goes back to the concept of building partnerships with people. And regardless of the person's rank, we enhance their education. Most medics in the Army when they're back home, all they do is kind of take vitals, they may take a history, but they don't do much of else. But when you empower the people on your team to take more ownership of the mission, you expand innovation and capacity of what you're trying to do. And this study was written by one of my mentors, Colonel Cotwall, about this very concept. The concept of leadership in bad situations, such as a mass casualty event, in eliminating preventable death. When you empower the people who are underneath you to do more things and you train them to the standard, people will live. And so listen to experience and flatten your organization. This was seen in 1994 in Tokyo, Japan. There was a terrorist attack that occurred where the emergency system allowed them to surge capacity to the hospital system and also take all of their antidotes, their 2-PAM and their atropine, and distribute it so the system didn't get overwhelmed. This is very much something that has been seen on the civilian side, the concept of surging your capacity so that people don't get overwhelmed with what they have. And so when there's a fire, surge more firefighters and maybe build more firehouses. And this even happens here, honestly. When something's happening, everyone wants to come and watch. If you are there, what are you doing? What is your purpose? Everyone loves to come watch. And if you are holding a clipboard, get out. You have to have security to determine who is important and who is not. The only non-clinical person who was in the fob was the person who's in charge of personnel, so we could track individuals who are hurt and rapidly provide that information to the battalion commander. Everyone else had hands on a patient and was doing something. And the importance about this is that the relationship we developed with the infantry unit that was there on the base was like, hey, I need soldiers to come to the aid station to protect it from the Gawkers. So you need crowd control. And this is kind of like one of the big factors is you have to rehearse. You have to rehearse every single time. And no one wants to do this because it takes time and effort. And it takes you out of kind of your daily routine. But sometimes people love to rehearse certain things, like the cool things. They love to kind of get the blanks out and kind of shoot, in the general direction. But because we developed that relationship, we would say, hey, that sounds like a good idea. How about we do it if 2 dudes get shot? And what people would do. How about we kind of change the scenario so we could test some of the medical skills that we've taught everybody? And by this stage in time, everybody on the forward operating base had been trained by either myself or someone on my team. And people initially groaned about this, but it goes back to those relationships. They said, no, this is what Doc wants. This is what Doc gets. And this was a weird study that I kind of found because I couldn't understand the methods, a mixed methods study. But basically, Ariana Grande did a show in Manchester, UK. And it was a great show, but there was a suicide bombing. And 22 people died. But 3 months prior to that, the National Health Service ran 2 large-scale exercises with their emergency providers to see did the same type of scenario, the exact same type of scenario. And then they sent surveys to them to ask them, hey, I know it sucks to take you out of this, role, but did this scenario, these 2 kind of simulations, help you with this event? And the answer was yes. And we did all types of training. We did, if there was a lack of blood, we practiced drawing blood off of service members and putting them into bags. We actually did that, very high fidelity. We practiced if the enemy came over the walls. We practiced if a rocket hit a tent. We practiced if a helicopter went down. Every single week, we practiced something. And we also turned up the intensity, which is not that hard with some of these people, but when someone's yelling at you and screaming at you, it takes your effectiveness, it takes it down, as the study has shown. Everyone can put on a tourniquet when it's quiet and there's musical instruments playing in the background. When someone's screaming at you, it changes. And so we practiced a lot, and we practiced really hard. And it can be tough to do this. It's tough because you just don't want to do it. You want to sit around, you want to eat, you don't want to train all the time. And in Israel, a country that is surrounded by countries that want to destroy it, they have kind of a collective sense of, we need to do this for our country. And they, similar to like our accreditation, their Ministry of Health, when they come down to the hospitals, both military and civilian, they grade them hard. They grade them very hard because they take this stuff very seriously. And in this kind of review article, he said that this is possible because there's a collective sense of we have to train in order to prevent a bad outcome, which is tough here sometimes because it just takes a lot of people out of the fight. This is a rare event that occurs. When we found out that things were going to kind of kick off, they kicked off. And in the winter, most combat operations don't occur because we can see the enemy walking in the snow and we can take them out. But when it's in the summer, that's the traditional fighting seasons. And it started to get pretty wild. Each attack that they do on the base, and we would have over 109 individual attacks on the FOB, we would refine the plan even further. There was a contractor, he lost his leg, and the casualty collection point that they went to go get the tourniquet, didn't have the right size tourniquet. Immediate change. He lost his leg, but we made an immediate change as to what we were going to do. And we were very professional about kind of that type of feedback. This video may not play, but the reason why I'm showing it to you is that this type of stress was all the time. This is a video with me under night vision goggles where we were just refueling. And I'm just sitting down and kind of just like getting a lay of the land. And a firefight, it's too loud. The point is that we didn't have a break. It was nonstop. Every single day we were getting hit, sometimes twice a day, sometimes 3 times a day. And that is an opportunity to improve. It is an opportunity to be like, this is where I jacked up, this is what I'm going to do, and I'm sorry it won't happen again. It's a different method of teaching that is very specific to the military. As I said, it was tough because it was very busy. People were constantly getting hurt, but again, we would refine and train. We would be like, okay, it took me 5 minutes to get to this spot. How can I cut it down? Okay, let me try this, that, the other thing. And this, let me try this. So the majority of attacks on the base were rocket attacks. And this is a anti-rocket defense system that we had purchased that was fairly effective at shooting down rockets. But as we will find out, it's not 100%. This is tough to see, but basically you're gonna find, and I'm sorry that this is super loud, but I'll point it out to you kind of, oh, my bad.
There's a volume control.
Volume
right
right
there.
On the right.
on the screen.
Where?
No, we're to the right of the play button on the very like lower right of the video. There you go.
Okay. So what you're going to see is a rocket that's coming up over here, and it gets blown out of the sky right there. And that is a successful engagement of an enemy rocket. Each one of these green dots is where a rocket exploded. And it was either partially impacted by the anti-rocket defense system, but as you can see, that a lot of it kind of hit close to home. Though the green dot that I'm going to talk about is this dot right here. This is where we all slept. I slept here, but everyone else slept right here. And this is the dot I'm about to talk about. On August 10th, a rocket that was shot in a particular trajectory bypassed our rocket defense system for a short period of time, having a direct hit on this tent, causing it to go on fire. There were 34 immediate U.S. injuries. However, there is a casualty collection point that is located right over here. And one of the guys on this talk right now, Captain Mark Yarmy, got fire extinguishers and started to put the fire out. Two individuals, one was a refueler and the other essentially was a repairer of helicopters. Two individuals who were less than 20 years old, who had never placed a tourniquet on anyone until they did the training that we taught them to do in the way that it was supposed to be done, placed two high and tight tourniquets on the most critically injured service member within less than 1 minute. Within 2 minutes, myself and my team were on the scene, and he'd already been placed on a stretcher that another service member had gotten from the casualty collection point. I called over to the surgical team and told them that I had a critical patient that I was bringing to them and to hold all flights going across the airway. We then rapidly progressed across the airway, the airstrip, to the surgical team, while other medical personnel then decompressed and said, head to the aid station, we're bringing in vehicles that were provided by the command team. And so we were very rapidly able to move people from the impact site to medical care. And once I got to the surgical site, I was still in communication with my NCO, Staff Sergeant Kiesel, that I would be back there shortly after giving handoff. And sometimes you will get lucky. And this was one of those days. In this picture is Lieutenant Colonel Peter Kreischman. I was his general surgery intern. When I arrived onto the surgical site, I dropped off the patient, and as I was leaving, he was like, Anat, is that you? And I was just like, yeah. And he was just like, all right, man, good luck. He was there on a break. He was on something called a ghost team, which is an extremely elite surgical team that is typically associated with high-performing Tier 1 assets, like the SEALs. He was just there just taking a nap. But he's the only vascular surgeon in Afghanistan. And the patient that I brought him had a 10-centimeter laceration of his superficial femoral artery.
Sorry.
They took him immediately to the operating room. They did a graft, and they rapidly took him from the FOB to headquarters to Germany, and then subsequently to Walter Reed. I obviously went back, and we did the drill that we've done every single time, and we did it like it was a textbook. We decompressed our system. We were rapid communication with higher levels of care. We knew exactly who was hurt and who needed follow-up. We had integrated our chaplain into our behavioral health casualties. So even though we didn't have a psychiatrist on base, he would sprint over and essentially offload those casualties so I wouldn't have to talk to them. He would see them, do an immediate intervention, and say, I'm going to see you tomorrow at this time. Each patient was eventually seen by me, and we spoke very quickly and frequently with the Roll 2, with the surgeons, to see who needed additional care, especially those who were hit with shrapnel, and if they needed external imaging or if they needed to be explored. But we were able to stabilize, decompress, and we surged our capacity, which were the themes that I kind of talked about at the beginning. This is a picture of what kind of a typical kind of resuscitation would look like. It's clearly very busy. This was not of that day. This was another American who got hurt. But as you can see, there's a lot of excellent and direct communication of what everyone is doing, why are you there, and how are we going to get this guy to the next level of care. Sergeant Brennan was hit with that laceration. He received the Purple Heart here at Walter Reed. And this is a picture of me with him and his wife, Kayla, back home when I got back from the war. He's able to walk. He's able to walk. He essentially has a very mild limp. But if you think about it, what we did was we developed a system, practiced it, trained to it. We were hard on ourselves, and it paid off. It clearly paid off. And it got even worse. It was super busy, but in any combat operation, you have like a list of the people that you want to take out. And the area where I was based became the focus of the war after this event. and all types of units were circling in and out and asking for medical support, and it was extremely exhausting. But within 30 days, the top 10 people that they wanted to kill were killed. And I published about this, basically similar to what Captain Tarpey did for the Iraq War. We wanted to kind of talk about the system and the process and what it takes to do this, because other people can benefit this within the military, but it absolutely can apply to people here. And the concept of COVID is the marathon mass casualty event. There is no shortage of people that are going to come in with respiratory illnesses, and it will overcome our native medical capability. It will overwhelm the people in terms of their medical skill. It'll put in undue amounts of stress. But the system has taken this and evolved. In a way, it's broken it, but it's evolved in that in this article here from Australia talks about the importance of us not forgetting what we learned from COVID, that there is still a value to having surge capacity, to being able to call in external people to kind of back you up, to not have pride, to be able to ask for help, to listen to science. We did that here. This is a picture of Jordan Gray during our simulation, and Jen Pope, the back of her head, and how we did it. And you'll find that the more you practice, the more you'll change. The more you'll make changes to your procedures. Like, what will be the role of general surgery in anesthesia in a mass casualty event? Are they just going to be in the trauma bay? Are we going to be using Epic, or are we going to be using physical pieces of paper? How are we going to manage and track people as they move through the phases of care? When you do more rehearsals, you're going to find problems, and you're going to be able to hopefully think of solutions to fix those problems. This is a little bit more personal, and I think, the way that I would approach this was a mass shooting that occurred in Pittsburgh at a synagogue. And when they approached people 1 year after they were involved in this event, 1/3 of them screened positive on a behavioral health screen. Anxiety, depression, smoking, alcohol use, and even amongst physicians who are involved with mass casualty events, the way they did this study out of Yale was that they sent surveys to people who were in Sandy Hook, who were in Las Vegas, and asked them, what did you just experience? What did you just learn from what you just experienced? And they found a couple things. One is that almost all physicians went into some type of advocacy. They talked about gun violence. They wanted to reduce the amount of gun violence in the country. 2, they were absolutely floored by the amount of media attention. But across the board, they knew that they had changed as human beings. That they themselves were just like, I think I want to leave medicine. I don't think I want to do this anymore. Or, I need to do more of this. And the point that I'm trying to make is that the military has found a solution to this, but it's very difficult to emulate on the civilian side, because in the military, we all go through officer training, like you mentioned, Dr. McEnroe. We all have very similar experiences. And when my mass casualty event happened, I sat around this very fire pit that Staff Sergeant Kiesel had built me. And my boss flew down from military headquarters, along with the bosses of all the people, some of the people who are on this call, and we talked about what just happened. And we smoked cigars the way they're supposed to be smoked, where you don't inhale. And I think this is really important, because the concept of sharing your story, sharing what you're feeling, is something we forget to do here on the civilian side, because we're afraid. We're afraid of how people are going to judge us and type of stuff. What was great about this, and I wish we could have done better, is that I wish we would have involved more enlisted people, kind of like the people who are not so high up. Like, it was obviously a lot of the officers, like myself and the chaplain and the helicopter pilots, like we would sit around and talk about stuff and smoke cigars. But I wish we would have included more people, because you have to decompress, because the stuff will live with you. The stuff will live with you. There was another mass casualty event that I had in which a child was decapitated. And I wrote about this. And a person in this room, Dr. Paul de Koning, read this article when I applied for residency. And you have to have a method to decompress the trauma that you've been through. And so the point is that the mass casualty incident you just experienced may have just changed your life. You need to understand that, and you need to come to grips with it. And this is a summary slide. To have some type of system, know how to implement it, build partners in preparation, prepare beforehand to the lowest level, listen to experience, even if it's coming from someone who's very different than you, flatten your organization, control your space, and practice. And when you practice like you mean it. Dr. Levine, I almost consider him like part of my legal team. This is a picture of him, like, with, because Dr. Levine's a little bit different than me, but he has been such a strong supporter in what at times has been a very challenging time here. So thank you. And that's it. All right. Thanks for coming. Any questions? Dr. Keegan.
I'm just curious your perspective on, say the legal environment is a little bit different in the military,
Yes,
in that you can change the standard of care to get jobs done or skip it if there are other higher priorities. And certain things like, marathon shootings, for example, you still may not be able to ignore the medium acuity background that still exists in the interest of a shifting mission. And I'm wondering if you've run across anything in your readings or have thoughts on, is anyone trying to, or how are people conceptualizing national crises standard of care for things like the recent COVID pandemic or other situations where resources do get substantially exceeded?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, and yeah, Dr. Garrick, you may be able to help me out with this one, but like in terms of kind of like major sporting events and stuff like that, there is kind of like you do the best you can with what you have, because the alternative is worse. And obviously then when you enter into a hospital environment where you have more things, then the standard of care changes. It's, at least in the military environment, is you do the best with what you have. But in the civilian side, I haven't personally heard, and sir, you can correct me, of like legal action against someone who did the best they could.
That has, one of my friends was in New Orleans around Katrina, and there were substantial legal issues surrounding crisis standards of care that were enacted.
Yeah. No, I can't, I can only speak to my own personal experience, sir. Dr. DeConing.
Thanks for a great talk, and thanks for this.
Sir.
I would imagine the system of iterative improvement was compressed in a time scale in the military, right? Because you don't have IRBs and all the things to kind of navigate the system to fix it. Like, we're still studying responses to COVID, whatever the thing is. So how do we, I wouldn't expect it to, maybe this is more of a statement. I would imagine that it's a very different thing to run that on the civilian side, where it's like, okay, this thing happened, what do we do next time? But that could take months and years to even just get somebody to study it.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you an example. It is very directive in the military. And there was a situation where there was an individual who made my life a living hell when I was deployed, but he was insistent that if you wanted to eat a meal on the base, you had to fill up a sandbag before eating. But there was no hand washing stations. And the dirt we would buy from I almost had a Freudian slip there, from the Afghans, had stool in it. So basically, we had no shovels, we'd be filling up sandbags, and then we would eat. And I was like, this is the dumbest thing ever. This makes no sense. And what are you doing with the sandbags? What you need to do is go out and get the dudes. So I went to my battalion commander and I said, sir, here are the 5 reasons why this doesn't make any sense. I'd like to make this intervention that we don't fill up sandbags before we eat. And he was like, done. It's just and it just is like a...
So you didn't study whether playing with poop before eating?
Exactly. It's over randomized control. We have this group that eats with poop. This group doesn't. Yes, sir.
One statement and one comment. Excellent presentation, and thank you for your service.
Thanks, sir.
I think your comment about convincing folks in your chain of command and outside of your chain of command and preparing for this was within their interests is so key to the residents in the room, because you all are going to go places and you're going to go to hospitals where sure they have a plan for MCI, or sure they have a plan for decon, because CMS or JCO requires them to have that policy on paper. But there may not be the energy or the enthusiasm to do what Anant has talked about, which is actually rehearse it and train it. And so in places where I have worked previously, it falls on the emergency physician to ask those questions of, what are we going to do? Because it's me at 2 a.m. that's single coverage when I get the base station call for the bus turned over. So I think what Anant said there about convincing people around you that it's within your interest to pay attention to this is so key, and it really will, in many places, for many of you, start with you. And then the second question, Anant.
Yes, sir.
Do you have any advice for the residents in the room about the command presence? So
yeah,
you told the story at USIS and no command presence, and do you have some like tips or tricks for how you go? We're all very comfortable in a single patient resuscitation, but that's different leadership skill than what you're talking about in terms of quote command presence. Do you have any tips or sort of advice for folks on how to make that switch?
Yeah, I mean, I think it very much is mine has been a process littered with failure. Like it is like essentially the reason why they recycled me was because I had no command presence. And so what I took away is that, where am I standing? If I'm standing in a place where I'm not seeing the people who are trying to do the things I'm going to ask, then I'm wrong. If you're in the back and you're quiet, and I think like this is a problem because some people will be like, well, I'm a quiet person, can I not have command? And that's not true. Some people can actually go in and, like my little sister's in the Army, for example. My little sister, when she has command presence, will come up and be like, my name is Captain Reese. I'm leading this resuscitation. It takes a lot to be like, all right, well, shit. Well, I guess she's here, But saying, verbalize, not just like kind of meandering in and being like, well, I'm the doctor, I'm the major, I'm the whatever, I'm guaranteed to be in charge. Who are you and what are you doing? Who are you, what are you doing, and what are you telling your team? And how are you talking? And who's doing what? Do they know that they're doing that? And can they say it back to you? Do they all feel like they're on the same mission as you? And that stuff just comes with a little bit of time. And I think the military, I think it makes me an asset to this organization. And it certainly makes me an asset to the people I'm going back to. Did that answer your question, sir?
Yep.
There. Dr. Babineau, great to see you. Yeah. Thanks, sir.
I'm really interested in I think the cognitive approach you have to any situation is really important to how it played out. So I guess I'm thinking about, I can struggle sometimes between rigidly following the plan versus having flexibility to react. And I imagine that's different both in the military and in civilian mass casualty incidents. But I don't know if you could just comment on how do you decide when I'm just going to, rigidly follow what we have practiced versus think outside the box?
Well, I don't think you can ever practice rigidly. The idea is that you practice multiple things. So you practice multiple things because you take away a lesson you learned from we need to draw off blood from a bunch of people to there's people coming over the hill to there's a helicopter crash. You can't be rigid in combat. There's a saying, I think Clausewitz is the first, every plan doesn't last the first contact with the enemy. You have to be flexible. I have in my mind the doctrine and kind of where people are going to stand, but very much is an amorphous, evolving process of now I have so many people, I need more trucks, I need more this, I need more that, I need more security. I don't think the concept of being, I think I see what you're saying is that there is you will stand here, you will do this, but that can change. The basic idea is there needs to be some type of command presence. I need to be able to see what people are doing. I need to know that the people who are under my command know what they're doing. I need to know that they understand what they're doing. And I need to take extreme ownership of that, especially if things go wrong, which I think can be the hardest part about leadership.
Question for the residents: is running a code and being in charge the same thing? Yeah, so there's plenty of situations where they're not, right? And I think this speaks to the command presence idea. And an example I'll give: we had a patient dropped off basically dead by anesthesia about 6 months ago in the ICU, and the anesthesia attendant left, and two anesthesia residents were both doing random stuff. The anesthesia attendant came back, and everybody's running around the circles. Neurosurgery is there, and I just asked, "Who's running this code?" And the anesthesia attendant said, "Yes, I will run this code." And then from that point on, it was clear who was doing the medical things. I would argue that's not the person who was in charge in that room. Nobody was until I asked that question. Sometimes just defining who's doing what is the most important thing you can do here, and making sure no role is unfilled.
Yeah, just to that point, sir. I mean, like I think, like my little sister, for example, like she's very different than me. She's got her shit together. She's got her life together. She's not as loud as me. But when she walks in to she's a pediatrician. When she walks into a pediatrician with a pediatric code, she'd be like, "My name is Dr. Reese. I will be running this resuscitation." Done.
I mean, I think a
Yes.
really important thing, first, that was amazing talk. Excellent.
Thank you, ma'am.
Appreciate it. But just reiterating what you said about practice, and obviously doing mass casualty practice, it's a big thing to coordinate, but just having the ability to command presence in a room is something you can practice at home. It's something you can practice in front of a mirror. It's something that, that's why, like with ATLS, you have these algorithms so that it's like second nature. And running a code should be second nature, but what very often isn't is when you walk into a room and now you don't know who's who. And, it's important that you establish that presence if you're running it, and if not, asking the question, who's running this, and then everyone in the room to identify who they are, because sometimes you walk into a room, you don't know who anyone is. Everyone's either masked, gowned, and IDs are covered, or they have having IDs. So I think it's really important to just take that minute to identify who's part of your team, what everyone is doing. But you can practice this at home by yourself. Just running it through your head mentally gets you ready. Fantastic.
Thanks. Have a hospital bed with some toys around it.
All right, thanks, guys.
I also argue the three big things for code: who's running it, who's doing access, or I'll say procedures, and it's because there's usually 8 or 10 people. Sometimes everybody assumes somebody else is doing one of those things and something. Those are, in my mind, 3. Like documentation. Okay,